today we're going to be discussing, is remote work a huge mistake? So I'm interested to see all of your comments in the chat today. It's going to be an interesting discussion. To discuss the topic, I'm going to be joined by my co-host and partner in crime, Matt Burns, founder and CEO at Bento HR and host of the Thinking Inside the Box podcast. And our special guest today, we've got Sara Milesson, who's the Vice President of HR for Trelleborg Group, a world leader in engineered polymer solutions based in Sweden. Hello, everyone. How are you both?
Hey, Chris. I'm doing good.
You're doing good?
You?
I'm all right. It's Friday. Is it Friday? I don't even
Yeah.
know.
It's Friday.
I don't even know. Sometimes I'm like in this virtual world where I actually don't even know what day of the week it is. So I don't know. That's one thing I'd say about remote work is that sometimes I forget about what day of the week it is. And it kind of the
Is
weekend.
that a good thing or a bad thing? That's
Yeah,
what we're
that's-
going to talk about, right?
That's true. Is it a good thing that you don't even know when it's a weekend or it's a work day? Kind of, it all blends together as well. So where should we even start things off, Matt? Like, I feel like this is kind of, I know recently me and you were talking about the Stanford research that was really sort of a 2-year study that showed that productivity boost of remote was the equivalent to a full day's work. Was that per month, per week? If I can't remember the additional full day of productivity. Was that just for a week, I'm assuming, or was it for a month?
Yeah.
A
Correct.
week.
For
A
a week.
week. So they're saying that basically by working remote, we get an extra day's worth of work out of our employees. Wow. Okay. And then on the flip side of that, we're also talking about the recent article from Sam Altman, who's the OpenAI CEO. If you don't know who OpenAI are, they are ChatGPT. If you haven't heard of ChatGPT, I don't know where you've been living for the last couple of months. It's always, and he was really insistent of the fact that we need to be in person to be creative. And he was specifically also focusing on startups and tech as part of that point. How do we kind of reconcile, Matt, these two contrasting views? The research, and then we've got all these CEOs. You've got Salesforce, you've got ChatGPT, you've got Twitter, you've got Facebook, you've got Tesla. They're all saying, no, we have to come back. Otherwise, we have no creativity.
Here's what I struggle with. When you ask employees and when you ask line managers, they tell you that remote work has increased productivity, increased flexibility and satisfaction, increased engagement, and opened up new sources of talent. When you ask CEOs of companies or commercial real estate representatives, they tell you that remote work is the worst thing to happen since.
I love the way you added real estate in
what.
there.
Yeah.
I love the way you added commercial.
Well, it is.
I love the way. I wonder why they're upset.
It's
I wonder
I
why.
wonder.
Yeah,
Well, it's almost as if organizations that own their own real estate are incentivized to have people back in their
because
offices.
they're paying for
Like,
it. Yeah.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
I think it depends on who you ask. Now, here's what we know. Study after study has shown us that from an individual contributor perspective, that remote work in some cases can increase productivity and certainly in some cases increases satisfaction. I was having this chat this morning. If you're an introvert versus an extrovert, it makes a big difference how you answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
But I love what Sarah said off air, which was we apply a standard around meeting people where they're at around a number of HR programs. But when it comes to remote work, we seem to make this a binary conversation. I'm confused as to how it got to that place. I think the reality is that we need to find space to create flexibility for employees to be able to work in the way that best suits them. If I'm a single parent and I have 3 kids, remote work might mean the difference between me having a little bit of time at the end of my day for myself or spending 2 hours in my car or on the train or on the bus commuting to and from the office. That's a big deal for me. If I'm an extrovert, I live by myself and I'm 21 years old and work is the source of most of my social activities, then of course I'm going to lament the loss of the office. But the reality is workplaces are a composite of a number of different kinds of people. But in making this conversation binary, we're doing everyone a disservice. So I don't know how you reconcile it. There isn't a single answer because life is complicated and work, if nothing else, is a manifestation of life.
Yeah. So what do you think, Sarah?
Well, from the one sentence that I gave you before we went on air, you put it beautifully now, Matt. And yes, I do agree because, I mean, we also have some research now showing that some of our youngest talents are feeling a sense of isolation. They're feeling a sense of mental burnout and so on. So on. Of course, because that is totally different. Their life is totally different and they associate work with different things and their colleagues with different things than you would do if you're like me and you live in a house and you have 2 children that I have to take care of. And then again, you would also associate it differently, just like you're saying, Matt, if you're extrovert or introvert. but not only in those two contexts, right? So if we say that everything else that we do, we cater for diversity, why are we not catering for diversity when it comes to hybrid work? And I also agree with you, Matt, it cannot be a binary discussion. It cannot be everybody is never at work or everybody is always at work. And I don't believe in a solution that says one size fits all. It needs to be up to an individual, a team, and the actual work that they have to do.
Matt, what do you think?
Agreed.
What do you think the reason is then? Like, because these leaders are seeing the research, they're seeing the data just as we are, but they're still demanding, you have to be in the office these 3 days of the week. Is it because is it generational? Is because they come from a different generation that could be part of it? Is it because it's just hard? Is it because it's just hard? We're talking about making we're talking about creating an experience that's individual and unique to each person, right? Which is really hard to do. Is that why we're so fast to come back? Because it's just too hard to face the alternative, which is going to take a lot of work, time, and you're going to make mistakes and
that in control.
Yeah. I don't want to speak for all leaders, but I can speak from personal experience. I've worked predominantly for global organizations, and the last role that I had as a CHRO, I was one of 2 people in my office on a team of 24. 22 people worked offsite, either across the country or across the world in some cases. My current team at Bento HR is completely remote. And it's way more difficult as a leader to manage work when people aren't in the same office as you, because you have to be more intentional about productivity, feedback, conversations around performance. You have to be much better about delegation, follow-up. You have to be much stronger about being thoughtful about intervention points, because you can't just simply rely upon the fact of, oh, I saw you in the hallway, Chris. I forgot to mention, let's have this conversation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I can't control your schedule and say, hey, I want to meet right now. I pop by your desk. Let's have this conversation. It's a different dynamic, and it's more difficult as a leader, I have found, to do this remotely. That being said, the world doesn't revolve around me as the leader. If nothing else as a leader, my job, I've always thought, was to facilitate. I've always grew up in a world of servant leadership. So if my employees wanted more flexibility, or wanted the ability to work from home, or needed to leave the work 2 hours early for an appointment, my answer was always yes, because it's a give and take. And you find space in there so that people can live their best lives, but also deliver to the organization purpose. And you try and find the soft spot there. And, let's be honest, if somebody's not performing, it doesn't matter whether they're at work or at home. You still have the obligation as a leader to manage their performance. It requires more intentionality. Now, I think Sara said it really well. There are some activities that, let's be honest, they're better in person. If we're doing team building activities, I'm sorry, I've been to enough wine conversations over Zoom to know it's not as fun as meeting for drinks at Friday afternoon after a long week.
Yeah.
It's not the same to do a performance conversation with my manager about my career development if I'm doing so over email. Like, there are some things that make sense to do in person, and we're not trying to say, to Sara's point, that it's binary. We're saying that let's be thoughtful about the types of social interactions that occur at work and figure out what makes sense, because it doesn't make any more sense to say to somebody, come to the office for 8.5 hours a day, sit at your cubicle, stare at your laptop with no interaction from your colleagues, and call that work either. That doesn't feel like that's an ingenuous use of people's time as well. So I'm thinking it's really about fitting the activity to the purpose, Chris, and just trying to find a spot that makes sense. And for leaders, it might mean that you have to test yourself and learn and grow. But we've had 3 years of practice. So if you've just stubbornly stuck to what worked for you for the last 20 years and haven't evolved for the last 3 years, and kind of shame on you, because there was an opportunity there for you to learn some skills and build some tools. And I know I'm papering over this and making it intentionally combative, because I think it's worth challenging. I understand it's not that easy, but I also don't think the solution is everyone go back to the office 5 days a week. That doesn't seem like a good solution either. It doesn't account for all the nuances that affect people's lives day to day.
Yeah, but
can I chip in on the leadership part? Because I think that what everything that you said, Matt, on how you view yourself as a leader and how you view yourself as a servant leader to your team, that is what we asked for pre-pandemic as well. It's just been amplified in this setting. You can no longer be a half-ass manager, to be honest. If you have remote teams, you have to show up and be really good at these things. But leaders are also humans, so they also have days when they are not at 100% of their game, right? So we also have to have a little bit of reflection also, not only from a leadership perspective, but also from an employee perspective. What are my expectations on my leader, and how do I verbalize them to make sure that we are on par with each other? So it's not a, this is something that management needs to fix or unfix. I think it's a responsibility of everyone in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Agreed.
Yeah. And I think everyone listening can agree it is hard. Who's listening, right? And
Chris, here's what I would add, Chris. The same report that talked about OpenAI CEO talked about how remote work has been challenged for technology companies. In the very same breath, he says some of my best employees are remote workers.
Yeah, it's true. He did say that. Yeah. it's kind of
So it's hard even for them, right?
Yeah. I'm sure. I wonder what their thoughts are when they read that. His own remote employees are like, what? What's going on here? It's interesting. Let's talk about some examples of companies. Matt, who are some examples of companies that you've come across that are doing a great job in terms of remote work?
I wanted to focus in on technology companies because the article dealt predominantly with worst thing that happened to tech is this advent of remote work. So we often in the broader, industry, I've never worked in tech as an HR leader, but we often looked at tech as, Netflix and Apple and Google as kind of like as you were shining lights of what employee culture could be. They had sprawling campuses and Michelin star chefs and all these wonderful places that you could go to and work. And those of us in retail were trying to figure out how we could order extra paper clips for the end of the week in terms of making things happen. So I often look at tech as the example of how things worked really well. But the honest truth is that tech has had a tough go the last few years as a lot of organizations overstated their growth objectives, and they've had a lot of significant layoffs in the tech industry.
Yeah.
And it's causing a lot of pressure in those organizations to deliver results. And unfortunately, what you see, Chris, is organizations, when they feel pressure, revert back to what is comfortable. And in this case means going back to the office. Now, to answer your question, there are many companies out there that have done remote work really well. I think about 3. GitLab is one example of an organization that's been remote first since the very beginning. It's 1,000 plus employees. It's a technology company that's gobbling up market share, that is growing like weeds, and is having significant success. I also look at a company like Zapier. Similar story. Zapier is another technology company that's predicated on integrations and collaboration. And wouldn't you know it, they've been able to do that with 1,000 plus employees since the beginning. And then last but not least, I look at a company like Ceridian, 6,000 employees spread across the world, an HCM technology company that has employees scattered everywhere, but seemingly is publicly traded, $1 billion plus in revenue, 6,000 employees, and able to make hybrid work, as it were, and the vast majority of employees aren't coming to an office 5 days a week. So there's lots of examples out there to look at, but to our earlier point, it just requires a greater amount of intentionality from the organization and its employees to make it work. It's a shared responsibility, but there are lots of examples. Basecamp is another one. Organizations that have been remote first since the very beginning, if you build it into your DNA, obviously much more easy to continue that path. Harder to transition if you've been a people first company in office first, but it is possible to make that switch.
Yeah. I love the fact you said GitLab. I interviewed their global head of remote work. No surprise they have a global head of remote work for an all remote company. And I've interviewed many other heads of remote, which is a new job now that seems to be springing up left, right and center. And one of the things that I found across all of those companies that you mentioned, Matt, because I've interviewed all of their leaders, is they all have an open source work policy. So what that means to everyone listening is that anyone in a business can see at any given time what anyone's working on, and they can contribute to that, which is completely a massive cultural shift, where in the past it was like the more senior you are, the more access you have to information. And that was like part of, now they kind of got rid of all of that structure and said anyone can see anyone's project. You could click on Chris, what's he working on, who's he working with, where are they in terms of their journey on that particular project, and you can offer to contribute to that. That's a big shift. Obviously, there are some other projects that are sensitive that obviously only certain people have access to, but the vast majority of work is open sourced, and they've created more collaboration, more networking. The challenge that companies have now of that knowledge share when you work remote. If you're new, for example, coming to a business in an in-person office, you had that organic knowledge share that kind of happened. And those interactions, they're now recreating that using technology. which I think is really cool. And it also fosters that shared responsibility of collaboration despite the distances you have between you, as well. So that's something I've seen, that people that are getting this right, they've really shifted that and more worked on
Well, and it
project
actually
based.
it it torpedoes an argument around accountability that often exists with remote work. People say remote work reduces accountability because you can't see people and therefore you can't actually control what they're
Good
doing.
point, yeah.
But when you offer open source, there's no greater accountability than being able to see what people are working on.
It's
So
not, yeah.
again, it dispels this idea of, I've had a lot of bosses over the course of my career, some of which were quite micromanaging oriented, but nobody actually ever leaned over my shoulder for 8 hours a day and looked at what I was doing every single hour. But they gave the illusion of accountability. Open source actually is transparency, can also lead to accountability as well. So I think the more we discuss this, Chris, the more I'm convinced that it's just a matter of us needing to shift the way we look at things versus to dispel the way of remote work being, if people work from home, they're not doing 8 hours a day of work, or they're not contributing to the company's objectives, or they can't be as creative. Like, you're right. If we apply the same thinking and the same paradigms, and we apply the same tired, habits that we've brought to the workplace for the last 100 years, then you're right. It's not going to be the same. But if you shift the way the culture works, you have the opportunity to increase all of those aspects and afford people flexibility. So I think it's just a matter of making that shift. And it's clear that a lot of organizations are struggling with that shift.
And for me, honestly, guys, it's also like, how do you measure success? How do you know that you were productive before? What was that based upon? It has to be based on some sort of KPI or the money you made or whatever. Has that particular sense of measurement dramatically shifted since people started working from home? If that's the case, yeah, then I understand your argument that people need to come back to the office. But if that's not the case, then maybe, just maybe, they are actually working, even though you can't see them.
Yeah, just because the person's in the office doesn't mean they're actually delivering an output.
No.
So, I've seen people work more hours than me and do less, right? We all know that as well. And it's so funny because me and Shane was joking about our KPIs in our previous company before we started this business. And the KPIs had nothing to do with output. It was like, how many hours did you spend on the phone?
Really?
Yeah. So we was in sales, right? So the measurements were how many phone calls you made per day, how many hours of conversation you had. But that has nothing to do with how many sales you're making, which is really...
No, it has nothing to do with the quality.
Yeah, exactly. Everything. I can keep going. We didn't know this at the time. We were obviously just early in our career, and every day our manager, well, Chris, you've done this many hours, you've done this many calls. And there were times where I was sitting there like, that's nothing to do with the amount of sales that... there were people being rewarded for doing 3 hours, 4 hours on the phone, but they haven't even done a deal or a sale, right? So you're like, what are we trying to measure right now? Like, what's going on? And I remember I had a hilarious meeting with my HR team. They took me into a meeting to talk to me about the fact that my performance wasn't as high as it should be, but I had the highest number of sales in the company. They were like, Chris, you're only doing 1.5 hours on the phone, so if you did 3, then you'd have double the sales. I was like, it doesn't work that way. The reason that I have 1.5 hours and they have 3 is I'm having higher quality conversations with the right people, and they're speaking to hundreds of people that aren't even buyers of our product. But trying to explain that to the team as a 20-year-old, we're like, what do you mean? Anyways, it's just a good example, right? Like, you could have someone sending all the right signals, but they're not actually delivering.
But isn't that crazy though? You were 20 some years ago, but we're still saying that that's the way. Some of our CEOs are still saying that that's the way that we should measure success, is if people are actually showing up to work or not showing up to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some other examples I think to share from like companies like GitLab is another thing that and again, other companies that I've seen do this really well is they document everything. Every single so for example, if that person was to leave tomorrow or that team just disappeared, they would have a detailed document of all of the processes, all of the systems, all of the templates, how it works, everything. And you have to have that. Again, if you're not, that's something Matt, I saw you nodding away there. I know you agree with this one. Make sure, and that's something me and Shane learned the hard way as founders. When we stepped away from managing everything, which is obviously what we had to do when we first started the company, we had to start documenting everything, because you realize that just because it lives in Chris's head or Shane's head doesn't help. It doesn't help anyone. So we had to start documenting everything So when someone comes into the business and they're working remote at HR leaders, they can go and see and access everything and understand every single function, and we documented in real detail every element
So
of that.
think about that from a CEO, like, you know, the successful CEOs of tech companies that you mentioned before, Matt, that we were talking about, and you know, how you revert back to something that you feel that this is what brought me success, and now I'm in a different context. Ergo, we have to go back to being in the office. I do not see those particular people as being people of documentation. You know, if I just look at them and who they are and their personalities, what is creativity to them and how do they act creatively? They do that by interacting with other people, and you only can do that if you have people around you all the time. Ergo, they're saying that the only way to be creative and the only way to be productive is to act exactly like me because I'm the CEO. But it's an interesting thought in the sense of, okay, so documentation, how, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Again, it's
It's
part.
so role
Go on, mate.
specific. I mean, Chris, I remember there was a study in 2020, end of, I think, fall of 2020, Google, everyone knows Google, and they did a study of productivity for their engineers. So a very much a productivity-based role, very easy to measure. And Google, probably one of the best jobs of any organization of measuring employee sentiment and performance. So when they measured sentiment and performance in the fall of 2020, 6 months into a pandemic, they actually were surprised to find that the people struggling most in this new world of work were new employees, people that were new in the organization and new in role. So when they dove deep and they started to have town hall conversations and meet with employees, they found out that documentation was one of the big gaps that people missed out on, knowing where information was, but also who to go to for answers, which traditionally at Google meant you go down the hallway, you pop by somebody's cubicle, you have lunch with somebody, and you fill in those knowledge gaps. So what did Google do? They began to double their efforts to document practices, document SOPs, create open source sources of knowledge to fill in those gaps so that new employees, whether that be in the organization or in the role, could catch up. And when they did that, wouldn't you know it, their performance rose to meet their peers. So Google, who is, again, a lot of times held up as an example of what to do right, they struggled as well with this. So we understand that documentation may not be your number one priority. It's not, frankly, one of my favorite things to be doing. But when you work with remote teams, if you want to transfer knowledge, you have to create a single source of truth. Otherwise, information is being passed around, and it's all being based on context and on leaders' preferences, and you have inconsistency and incongruencies.
But don't you think that that's one of the very main reasons why some of these CEOs are saying we don't like remote work? Because they hate documentation. They hate everything that goes with how to be a good leader in remote work settings, right? It's easier to just have everyone come back.
It's like,
for them,
remote work's like shine a spotlight on bad leaders, hasn't it? Like if you're a bad leader and then you've gone remote, it's just 10x. All of those. And if you were a great leader, it was an easier transition, and actually a lot of the things that you were doing already, making sure you're checking with your employees, making sure that you have those conversations, like all of those things that you mentioned, Matt, before, you can lean even more into those as well, with the help of technology, of course. So yeah, communication is a big element of that as well. All companies that I've seen doing great remote work, they've have incredible great communication strategies, very asynchronous communication, making sure that they understand how to communicate across different time zones, using technology for that, right? Even something simple like at the end of your email saying, hey, if this isn't I appreciate this be coming to you during a time that you're in a different time zone, don't feel obligated to reply. Even just having things like that people don't, because you end up seeing, we saw some research from Microsoft from Teams that they realized that people were working over their entire weekend to reply back to an email, but because that CEO sent it on a Friday evening, without realizing the knock-on effect that would then have across all of those poor people. And we don't really realize sometimes, and I've made that mistake before with my team, just because I'm up at 1 a.m. thinking about work and I drop an email, not really thinking the knock-on effect of work that has on them. So it's really important that we get that communication piece right.
But those are leaders. I mean, we've dumped on leaders a lot in this conversation, so I want to try and balance it because we're all also leaders. And the historical bias around leaders is such that you bring people to you when you want them to do work, and you center the work around the leader. So it's a centralized form of communication, centralized form of accountability. It's almost like a hub and spoke method if you look at transportation maps. In remote work, that doesn't actually make sense, because in remote work, you need to create decentralized forms of decision making, decentralized forms of communication, decentralized forms of creativity, which makes the leader not at the center of it. And for some leaders, that's really hard, both in terms of how they've led in the past, and also for their egos, and also for the tools. So by empowering people, you actually create leadership at the individual contributor level, and you can still create touch points and checkpoints to do that, but it requires a fundamental shift in how you look at leadership. If leadership for you has always been holding court and sending people out to do work, having them report back, that will not work in a remote setting in the same degree as in the office, because you rely upon so many assumptions that are being made that you can't affirm in a remote setting. So you fundamentally have to shift work, and you have to trust people in a way that you haven't trusted them before. And that, for some leaders, is really, really hard to do when you're being held accountable by your leaders to get certain jobs done. So again, we go back to some things would benefit from being in the office. Maybe you need to bring people in. There's a SWAT team needs to come together because you have a special project, tight timelines, high urgency, high visibility. Okay, fine. But if someone's doing their mundane week-to-week tasks, we can afford them more flexibility, more autonomy, more agency to get the work done. And as a leader, I mean, just letting go a bit and finding that space. And I get it. It doesn't happen overnight. There's a learning process that has to occur, but it can include accountability. It can include communication. And Chris, in a world where, I don't know about you, but I've never felt more expected to check my emails today as I did ever before. Like, the reality is we're all living in a global world 24/7, 365. And the expectation around response times means that we're all essentially working kind of asynchronously anyway. So it's a migration more towards that way of working, as opposed to fitting things into the traditional 9-to-5 schedule.
I want to add to that, because I think it's not only what type of tasks that you're doing, but it's also who you work with. I mean, even before pandemic, my job has been global. That means that even if I did go to a particular office, half of the people that are my stakeholders were not in the same office, and we didn't even have video cam. We called each other on the phone, and we didn't even have video.
Remember those things called phone calls? Yeah.
I know. And still it worked, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we are kidding ourselves if we say that this is a brand new era for everybody. Everyone who's ever worked in a global setting has already experienced remote working.
Yeah.
Why is it all of a sudden so scary to do?
It's such a good point. I think that one of the problems I am having, Matt, you mentioned about never more pressure to have your email, but now I have to check 5 or 6 platforms. I'm like Slack, LinkedIn, WhatsApp, email. So that's a whole other challenge as well. Like, technology is also is great, but we need to make sure we get it right and find a balance of. And again, as part of those of working remote, clearly you have to have a set of practices around how and where we communicate. Because that can also get pretty tricky. You know, this is our chat to have these conversations. This is the chat to have those conversations, and let's not, go crazy. And it's funny because Shane was like to me yesterday. He was like, "Hey, did you get that contract I sent over?" And I was like, "No, I haven't seen it anywhere." And it was in my text messages. Like, it's so obvious. But I looked every single place but my text messages. I was like, okay, we need to, when we talk about these things, this is where we communicate. And you have to have you have to create processes around that and be very clear to avoid that miscommunication. A lot of the things that we're talking about is lack of communication. Like, I'd say 90% of the issues that I hear people raising stems from bad communication as well. And it gets, as you said, it gets even harder when you're remote in terms of how you communicate as well. So I'm sorry to those leaders and managers. We're not trying to pick on you. We're also in the same position as well. I find it just as challenging. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean that's an excuse just to default back to where we were before, because it's really easy to do that, and I've had to learn that from my team who I originally also personally started to default back to the older way because it was easier and it wasn't better, it's just what I was used to. And my team was like, "Hey Chris, no, if we're coming in, we need to come in for a reason." And I was like, okay, all right. and I've been working with them, and today, for example, we're celebrating some wins. So we're all meeting as a team. We're going to do virtual Formula One racing today after work, whatever that is. It's gonna be fun. And then we're gonna go to a bar and play table tennis in a bar. So it's nice to celebrate those wins, come together and celebrate. And I think those things are best done in person. So everyone's coming to meet. Anything we've missed? Anything we've missed? I feel like we covered quite a lot there. Yeah, like parting piece of advice for the audience. Sarah, we'll
I
start
kind of
with you.
like what I kind of like what you were saying, Chris. That just because it's hard doesn't mean that you get to revert back to what's comfortable for
Yeah.
you, whomever you is, right?
Yeah.
And the title that you hold. So just have that in mind.
Yeah, as humans.
Yeah, and I would just add, sorry, Chris, I would just add that I think this is a great time for us to deploy some empathy. Like everybody is feeling the pressure in 2023, whether you're leaders, whether you're employees, and ask yourselves whether or not if the decisions you're making are in service to you and only you or into your broader team. Because the reality is, if you can work with your broader team and be a servant leader, then you'll be able to empower them to do their best work, which will, as a leader, ultimately make your life a lot easier as well.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a perfect place to end it. Thank you for joining us, Sarah, and coming along. And Matt, good to see you as always.
Thank you for having me.